Thank you, Michael. Daja hao, tēnā koutou katoa. Good morning, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's not often that I'm in the same room as three of my bosses. Right Honourable Helen Clark, Mayor Phil Goff, and of course, Right Honourable Jacinda Ardern. These linkages are, can I also acknowledge Simon Bridges? Don't call me Davo again on TV, please. We share a slot on with Duncan Garner until the election for those that are up early on Friday mornings. On Friday, I ran into Phil and we were talking about drinking water. On Sunday, Helen Clark phoned me about WTO Director General position. But the nicest thing of all was on Saturday night, I babysat for Neve. So we're a team. What extraordinary times we live in. There are very few places in the world that can have a gathering like this. And they've been pretty difficult times in every country, and it's been a pretty tough time in politics this year too. And I don't know why, but it's cracked me up a little bit. Jacinda, you have done an absolutely brilliant job, and I'm sure we all thank you for your part in that. I echo the Prime Minister's comments that China is one of our most important relationships and that there's so much to be positive about. As Michael's just said, who would have thought, that two-way trade would now be $32 billion? It really has exceeded all expectations. It was just $8.6 billion in 2007, the year before Phil Goff negotiated and Helen Clark signed our free trade agreement. According to some measures, New Zealand is now China's largest overseas source of food. Who could have imagined this just 15 years ago, when we're not even any direct flights between our two countries? We've come so far, and this is to be celebrated. I've had the privilege of visiting China 3 times in my capacity as Minister for Trade and Export Growth in 2018 and twice in 2019. And I've developed a good relationship with China's Minister of Commerce, Zhong Xian, with Vice Minister Wang Shouwen. During my visit to Shanghai in November, I heard firsthand of China's commitment to open markets to the rule-based international trading order, and they hosted a mini WTO ministerial while I was there for the China International Import-Export. New Zealand's participation in these events sends a strong signal to the world of our mutual commitment to fair trade arrangements. There have been a number of specific highlights since the summit last year, beyond those which the Prime Minister referenced in her speech, and so I'll quickly run through them. In May, the administrator of China's National Forestry and Grassland Administration came to New Zealand for talks with Forestry Minister Shane Jones, which time they signed an updated forestry cooperation agreement, and there were follow-up talks on that in December. In June and again in November, Tourism Minister Kelvin Davis visited China in support of our tourism sector and signed an updated agreement with China's Ministry of Culture and Tourism, including a provision for high-level dialogue on tourism and exchanges. This has, as was said by the Prime Minister, an emphasis on sustainability and innovation in tourism. And although international tourism has been very hard hit by COVID-19, the sector will recover, and the government's got a plan to help prepare for this. In August, Minister Damien O'Connor, our Minister of Agriculture, Food Safety, and he's also Trade Minister negotiating RCEP for us, he made a successful trip to Beijing and too had meetings with Minister Zhong Xian and Vice Minister Wang Shouwen. He also met with Vice Minister Zhang of the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs. In November, we hosted the visit by Minister Xiao, the State Administration for Market Administration. He came to Wellington, and again he met with Minister O'Connor and held the first of what are to be annual food forums on food safety. It's an issue which is very, very important to both countries, and which COVID, of course, reinforces. In November, as the Prime Minister mentioned, we announced the conclusion of our FTA negotiation upgrade. that improves existing commitments, including areas that weren't covered. We're looking at options for the signing of that agreement at the moment. That's, of course, been a little bit disrupted by COVID. As the Prime Minister noted, this agreement offers new access to service markets, eliminates tariffs on some more board and paper lines, and improves custom procedures as well as updating the e-commerce provisions. Of course, in November, I also attended the second International Import Expo in Shanghai. About 100 businesses exhibited, 38 in an NZTE-funded space in the food and beverage hall, 8 in medicine and health area, and almost 50 booths which were organised independently. So it shows an enormous commitment of the people in the audience to that event, for which I thank you. I know that many New Zealand exporters, together with NZTE and the China Chamber of Commerce, are already planning for the third expo, and it's a worthy thing to involve yourselves in. The relationship, of course, benefits many parts of the New Zealand economy, but I would mention that the Maori economy, it's important for them. Of the record $741 million worth of exports from Maori authorities last year, 354 million were to China, and China remains the top export market for Maori authorities. So, I'm pleased with the steady pace of bilateral engagements and exchanges pre-COVID, all of which have set us up well to deal with the current uncertainty. During the worst of the outbreak in China, New Zealand helped maintain supply lines not just for food but for crucial ventilator components which were supplied by Fisher & Paykel Healthcare. The Chinese diaspora in New Zealand, together with the contact that we have in New Zealand via our extensive trade links, I believed helped New Zealand realise early the risks posed by the pandemic, and I think those close linkages have aided New Zealand's preparation for COVID, which is one of the reasons, it's one of many, that have meant that we have fared better than some other countries. Our two-way trade was, of course, affected by the lockdowns in both countries earlier this year, as well as the supply constraints that arise from COVID. These challenges are ongoing, and amidst the upheaval, I thought it would be helpful to give an update of some of the actions that New Zealand's taking to help. We realised very quickly when Air New Zealand came knocking on our door that there were a lot fewer flights coming in and out of New Zealand. It's obvious to everyone. So our international air freight capacity scheme was set up pretty promptly, and we've worked with airlines to add capacity and to maintain minimum links with global markets, which otherwise would have collapsed further. We're well aware of the disruption to supply chains, particularly in respect of air freight, and this scheme goes some way to providing certainty that our exporters can get their products to market. We will also continue our efforts to protect international connectivity more broadly to the ongoing benefits of exports. With travel by exporters and their agents so severely constrained, exporters are ever more reliant actually on government initiatives, particularly through NZTE but also through MFAT. And we've stepped in with an additional $216 million over 4 years in the May budget to expand NZTE's capacity with its network of in-market business development managers. We're essentially doubling the number of New Zealand export firms that can obtain the benefit of the intensive Focus, or it was the Focus 700 group. That it roughly doubles, and in addition we've developed and rolled out online tools that provide assistance to firms while travel remains restricted for their own people or for their agents. We've got teams in Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Chengdu ready to help exporters, in addition to the China team based in Auckland. MFAT support's also increasing. It's led a cross-agency group to assist exporters in market. It's scaling up its economic diplomacy efforts, including by expanding its exporter services and increasing the flow of market insights. MFAT's already publishing COVID-related market insights from offshore posted on its website, and these have been well received, I know, by business. like NZTE, MFAT through embassies and consulates can offer some forms of in-market support for companies unable to travel in current circumstances. As touched on earlier, of course, international tourism has been hit hard. In May, we announced a future tourism task force as part of a $400 million response package. This public-private partnership advises on what changes New Zealand can make to the tourism system and make recommendations to address productivity, inclusivity and sustainability issues. We're also taking the opportunity of a bit of quiet time in Queenstown to do some of the major transport upgrades they need there. There's a big diversion to try and ease the traffic gridlock that we've just funded, and we're actually putting through the shortcut RMA process to get an early consent. We're also looking closely at innovation and export education with the Future Focus program, and we've continued to maintain New Zealand's visibility as a high-quality study destination. International students are, of course, a key group in our planning for managed border entry arrangements. Of course, these domestic efforts are only part of the puzzle. We're also working internationally to assist our exports. This includes defence of the international rules-based trading system, embedding our economy in emerging regional architecture such as RCEP, which is likely to conclude this year, albeit without India, and supporting regional global efforts through the likes of APEC, the WTO. In these areas, China and New Zealand are well aligned. Earlier this month, we were very pleased that China joined the Singapore-New Zealand-led ministerial statement on trade connectivity, which includes now 9 other countries. We embarked upon this very early on in the COVID pandemic with Singapore, and it's good to see that we now with China have committed to refrain from imposing export controls or tariffs and non-tariff barriers and to removing existing trade restrictive measures on essential goods, especially medical supplies. In May, New Zealand and China came together to support APEC with our commitment to ensure trade and investment continues to flow to help counter the impact of COVID. This commitment promotes a more stable trading environment for our food exports, and it would also help provide reliable access to critical medical supplies that we need. And as New Zealand gears up to host APEC virtually in 2021, I'm sure China will be one of our most important partners in seeking an agenda that supports fair trade and open markets. In April, China and New Zealand joined with others to establish an interim solution for hearing appeals and trade disputes between governments and customs territories in the WTO, a move that followed the impasse that saw the World Trade Organization appellate body cease to function. This solution will sustain a 2-stage dispute settlement system for participating WTO members, including both China and New Zealand. We believe that ensuring that the international trade rules remain enforceable is particularly critical at this time of economic turbulence and rising protectionism. So with all this work in play, what next? I want to turn briefly to where I see New Zealand's economic recovery from COVID-19 heading and how China fits in. As the Prime Minister has said, China and New Zealand have different systems of government, and we'll always have differences. But differences between New Zealand and other countries are normal. There have been many over the course of our history. The most well-known example is our steadfast opposition to nuclear weapons. In New Zealand, our citizens expect the government to expressly defend our values, irrespective of the size of the issues. We take pride in our values, and we're respected for this. As the Prime Minister said, differences need not define our bilateral relationships, to which we remain committed. Even though we will continue to have differences with China, China and New Zealand will continue to be important markets for one another's business. For New Zealand, China represents about 20% of our total two-way trade in the world. And with China's early emergence from the worst effects of COVID-19, we've seen the result in higher demand for exports like dairy and meat, and that figure may increase again in the coming year. We will seize opportunities to trade in new areas like those that benefit from the e-commerce chapter in our FTA upgrade, and existing areas will adapt. for example, through online services and education. I hope that in time, in addition to driving trade recovery, the pivot many exporters will have undertaken to enable them to access higher value export opportunities during COVID will actually assist them to advance their journey from volume to value. Although China will continue to be an important export market for New Zealand businesses, it's one of our two most important relationships, the obvious other example being Australia just across the ditch. I'm keen to see our trade with other markets across the world increase too. All countries pursue diversification, and so should the companies in this room. While it's up to firms to judge which markets they export to, the government tries to ensure that you have as many options open to you as possible. I expect work to ramp up on this post-COVID, for example, with our newly launched negotiations with the UK on an FTA, our negotiations on an EU FTA, and of course RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership with China and many other countries. Finally, I strongly believe that we need to trade to get us through this COVID crisis. I also believe that trade and investment, we've got to be careful that it works for New Zealanders. That's why we've recently announced a strengthening of our Overseas Investment Act. Some of those changes are temporary because we really don't know what are going to be some of the short-term effects from COVID, and we, like other countries, have just reserved ourselves a right to have a bit of a check as things change and shake down. Some of the other changes will be permanent, and we will continue to push our Trade for All agenda to support sustainable and inclusive growth that benefits all parts of society. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, Ambassador Wu, as the Prime Minister said before, China is one of New Zealand's most important relationships. The relationship is in good shape. We continue to appreciate our similarities whilst respecting our differences. As a recent Asia-New Zealand Foundation survey noted, more Kiwis than ever regard Asia as important to develop ties with. China is one of the first to emerge from the worst effects of the pandemic, along with others across Asia Pacific, will be a feature of our diplomatic and trade efforts, and I'm sure the region will continue to present new opportunities. The road ahead won't be easy economically, but whether it will be at the China Chamber of Commerce or New Zealand, or the New Zealand Business Roundtable in China, we do take on board your inputs and suggestions, and we look forward to doing so again at today's summit. The Prime Minister ended on whakatauki. I know the Chinese are all also a proverb-loving people. So to quote a Chinese saying, "Deep roots give rise to flourishing leaves." I really hope that I've been able to reassure you today that the China-New Zealand trade relationship is resilient and that we've got plenty of initiatives underway to weather the current global disruptions. Enjoy the summit and the outstanding speakers that you're scheduled to hear from. Thank you for listening. Cheers.
Minister, thank you very much. I must say that I probably missed out on the first bits of your speech. I got totally distracted by the fact that Simon Bridges would call you Davo. And then I kept
Hear that, Simon?
Yes. And then I kept on sort of thinking, I wonder what sort of a rate you charge for babysitting.
The privilege was mine.
The privilege, of course. Minister, a little bit of good and bad. If I have a look at what we gained over the April-May period, if you look at our exports, apples, kiwi fruit, meat, I think health, equipment and so on, you touched on those. Can we build on that, or what are you doing to build on the exports of those in particular to China?
The export profile in New Zealand is actually changing for the better, not only in our traditional strengths where we of course produce a lot more branded product, And I think we are increasingly trying to extract brand values for some of the things that we bring to the world that products from a lot of other countries don't. You know, we bring liberal values, respect for human rights, freedom from corruption, high environmental standards, in addition to the food safety and quality of our products. And I think New Zealand exporters are increasingly aligned with our government's ambition, or we aligned with theirs, you can put it both ways, to try and increase the specialisation and the branding that we wrap around that in order to extract value from those attributes. But in addition to that, of course, the high growth sector in our economy actually is in technology. And I've got a personal interest in pushing both of those things. You kindly sort of referenced A2 Milk, which I was the founding CEO of. But I'm just blown away, and I find it intellectually stimulating to go around the New Zealand businesses who are producing technology solutions. This huge opportunity rising out of this affordable computing power, robotics, sensors, big data, and the Internet of Things. This is creating a myriad of new inventions in the world that increase efficiency or improve environmental outcomes, and there's a demand for those products out there in the world. And so those organisations, I know from reports that I get from the ministries who regularly survey during this COVID pandemic the fortunes of our various companies, a lot of those companies are continuing to thrive. So the relative place of those high growth technology companies will increase over time.
But if I have a look at the other side, if I have a look at tourism and say education, so over 400,000 visitors from China coming to New Zealand, 40,000 students, we're not going to quickly replace that revenue with technology, are we? So my question still stands, what is it that we're doing to try and replace that revenue that we've lost?
Well, we're trying to grow everything that we can grow. There's for those who've travelled in recent weeks, you'll see that there's a lot more domestic tourism spend happening than we might have expected. Just a month ago, people, I think, because of the privileged position that we have in terms of having managed to stamp out COVID from community transmission, people are substituting some of their spending decisions by travelling more inside the country, which is a really good thing. In respect of the growth in our traditional export sectors, I've already mentioned it. In terms of domestic demand as opposed to export demand, one of the things that we're very conscious of as a government, that it's important that we don't get into a depression spiral, and that's one of the reasons why we're running such large deficits at the moment, to try and support people to stay in their work so that we can maintain confidence in the economy for both demand and investment. So overall, I think we've got the package about right.
I've got questions coming through on the screen here, so I'll go to those. If anyone has a question, you should feel free to put up your hand and we'll come to you as quickly as we can. From James Wong, the question is, would Minister Parker support any approach by a Chinese company to acquire the smelter in Bluff?
We wouldn't be opposed to that. Those are commercial decisions that are taken by the owners of that installation. It's, I think, 75% owned by Rio Tinto and 25% by Sumitomo Corporation. I don't think we're completely clear as to what the future of the smelter. We in government are taking them at their word that they're likely to wind it down, but it is possible that they may choose to sell it, or it is possible that there will be other more profitable uses for the power that is released if that was to close down.
Question here from it's gone, no, it's back, Tracy Epps. There are ongoing questions internationally about the compatibility of China's economic model with WTO rules. How can New Zealand work with China and other members to pursue WTO reform that provides flexibility for different economic models while promoting a level playing field for countries like New Zealand?
Were that easy. Look, the WTO is at a crisis point. The appellate bodies stopped working. There've been no significant update to the WTO rules for close to a decade now. The last significant change was agreed in Nairobi with New Zealand in the chair, I think. Was it, Stephen? When I think Vangelis was in the chair when they knocked out new rules to prohibit export subsidies for food products. But since then's virtually nothing changed, and there's hostage taking on both sides. There's developing countries stand behind special and differentiated treatment and say they won't change, and then developed countries say we're not going to give up on the protections that we maintain, particularly against the products that are sold from developing countries. And that impasse will be the most difficult thing for the new Director General of the WTO to overcome. Can it be overcome? I think only time's going to tell that. That's why second levels of insurance outside of the WTO are very important for New Zealand in respect of plurilateral and bilateral agreements. And of course, our bilateral agreements include our China FTA or arrangements with Australia, and plurilateral agreements of importance include CPTPP. There are some really good provisions in CPTPP that we hope to see advanced through the WTO. We have a view that we can bring forward some of these advances that the world needs through what we call open plurilaterals, and the Prime Minister made reference to another one, which is our agreement on climate change, trade and sustainability. We've got another one on electronic agreement that we've just signed up to with Chile and Singapore. So both from within the WTO and through our open plurilaterals, we try and push the system towards fair outcomes that we think every country should be able to live with, including New Zealand and also including China.
Minister, the Prime Minister mentioned Premier Lee a couple of times in her address, and I think in recent times he's made suggestions that China could look at participating in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. What would be the benefits of China participating in that?
Well, it would give further credibility to that very high quality agreement. It would address some of the issues that were referred to in the prior question by the questioner. And of course, it's an agreement that's designed to be open to new participants. So we've welcomed that suggestion. We're the depository for that agreement because we started it.
Yep.
But we haven't had an official request for membership. But I'm sure were that to be received, we would look at it seriously.
One of the suggestions, I think, at the time was that if China was a part, then it would impose stronger reforms on them in respect of trade. Do you agree with that?
Yes, it would. It has some constraints on methods of support for state-owned enterprises that trade internationally. So they would have, yes, they would be of import.
And of course there'd be some barriers or hurdles to overcome, because I think there's tension between Australia and China and the United States and China, and that takes me to one of the questions that's here. Will Australia's current attitude towards China influence the position of the New Zealand government?
I think the Prime Minister's already answered that in her reference to the fact that we stand on our own principles and we always take our own decisions based on our values, our principles and our own interests.
It's all right. What happens on the screen is you read a question, you think, right, I'll go to the next one, but somebody's rotating them here. So can you please expand on the areas for cooperation between China and New Zealand in the area of climate change?
Well, we have a dialogue that between our two countries. One of the areas that I push when I'm overseas on trade is I realise that New Zealand can't get our climate changing emissions down if we don't electrify transport, or decarbonise transport, I should say.
Yep.
And there are two parts to that. One is battery electric vehicles and the other is hydrogen. And I address both in my role as Trade Minister when I'm overseas, trying to engender interest in other countries, seeing New Zealand as a very good test bed for experimentation on their new technologies, and also a good market for their goods. One of the things I would be interested in pursuing is what more cooperation we can get around electrification of transport. China, I think last year China put more than 50% of the battery electric vehicles that were added to the world fleet were added in China. There is no doubt that they're a world leader in that technology. We don't actually have many Chinese battery electric vehicles in New Zealand yet. We should do, and we should be using our linkages to bring about that transition. And of course, we do already have significant hydrogen partnerships with the likes of Japan and Korea, but we're interested in similar advances with China.
Questions from the floor? Anybody sitting there with a burning question? Yes, I have one down here. If somebody would like to make their way here with a microphone. Table 7. Perhaps while you're coming through there, I'll ask the question from Dan Delane. Does the recent announcement of the closure of the Tiwai smelter and the announcement of a strategic review of New Zealand steel present an opportunity to develop more sustainable, high-tech alternatives with China or other partners?
Well, I suppose the first point I'd make is that we don't have any, in principle, opposition to the production of aluminium or steel in New Zealand. And indeed, the steel and aluminium produced in New Zealand are the lowest carbon steel and aluminium that's produced in the world. So to a certain extent, if those industries are lost in New Zealand, the world's environment will get worse because the alternative energy sources for aluminium and steel production overseas are more carbon intensive. That said, in the end, economics will out in these decisions, and if there are more profitable uses for that electricity in different sectors of the economy, you would expect to see that energy move to other uses to the effective benefit of New Zealand, and that's how a free market economy works, by the allocation of resources to high value uses. In terms of if they were to leave, if the smelter was to close down, what would replace it in the demand for electricity? Well, it could be data centres. It could be production of circuit boards. It could be production of hydrogen. It could be a combination of all of those things. It could be a short-term reduction in electricity and a drop in the electricity price, which would have other economic benefits. So it could be the substitution of that electricity use in transport, which would reduce our importation of oil. So these things, it would in likelihood be a combination of all of those things, including some investment in more transmission assets.
Good morning, Jade Gray from...
Can I get you to stand?
No
Introduce.
problem.
Thank you.
Jade Gray from Gung Ho Ventures. The question's around biotech, and I know on the Prime Minister's visit to China last year, Premier Li Keqiang mentioned that they'd like to widen the knowledge around food safety and traceability, either software, hardware expertise. In light of COVID and the huge concerns around food safety in China right now, public-private initiatives, have you seen anything come across your desk?
Well, I made reference to the bilateral meetings at a ministerial level, which happened in the last year with Damien O'Connor, and visits from the gentleman whose name I forget, I'm sorry. in return, that opens up those opportunities. They're in part opened up by those government-to-government initiatives, which would then, I think, lead to opportunities for the private sector participants in those areas to help take New Zealand's expertise to China.
Other questions? I've got one down here, table 5, if you'd make your way, and I've got a question over here.
Where do you want to go first?
Yep, please.
Okay, Minister Parker, look, I'm sure the legalisation of cannabis lobby would be very pleased when you say grow all you can grow. That's just a big opening for them. Sorry, my name is Pat English. I've had a wee bit to do with China over the last while, and I'm very pleased that we have got this emphasis. Great to hear what the Prime Minister had to say this morning. What I'd actually like to ask you about is compliance cost. I'm disappointed that Phil Goff left because I was going to take a dig there as well. But between central government and local government, compliance costs are increasingly making it difficult for New Zealand companies and sectors to be competitive internationally. Is there any view, approach or strategy that the New Zealand government has on addressing some of those compliance costs?
Well, I think every government always has a view that we want to minimise unnecessary compliance costs. Some compliance costs that are faced by New Zealand exporters in the food safety area are actually essential to their being able to access the markets that they want to sell into. So our food quality assurance systems, which are very, very rigorous in New Zealand and probably amongst the toughest in the world, are not so much designed, or not only designed for the safety of New Zealanders, but they're designed to meet the most unreasonable demands of some of our export markets. They were originally designed in order to meet what were sometimes trade barriers in Europe, mainly. But as a consequence of meeting those, we've actually ended up with systems that are respected around the world and enable us to sell into those markets. In respect of other compliance costs, I don't accept the proposition that New Zealand's compliance costs are higher than a lot of other countries. In fact, I think we've been world leaders at the use of internet-based tools for a lot of government functions, whether it's annual returns, tax returns, or the like, which are, obviously another two areas of compliance costs that government puts upon businesses. The two areas, or the area that's grown most significantly in recent years was health and safety requirements in the workplace, which was advanced by the last national government. We supported that because New Zealand post-ACC grew to have a very poor workplace safety record relative to other countries like Australia. And that's probably partly an outcome of ACC. Wonderful system, but you didn't really have the litigation risk and insurance industry risk minimisation measures, and therefore there was a need for a regulatory responsive government. The reference to Phil Goff that you made, I'm sure, was a reference to the planning system, both in respect of RMA planning constraints and complexity around Building Act compliance. And I agree that both of those areas actually need work. In respect of the RMA part of that, which I actually have responsibility for as Environment Minister, I sort of put it in three phrases: it costs too much, takes too long, and it hasn't protected the environment, which is a pretty damning indictment on the outcomes of the RMA, given that we've had declining water quality, increasing climate change emissions, and problems with the cost of housing. So it really hasn't been a slam dunk success for the RMA, which is why we've already just legislated to change and speed up plan-making processes for water issues. We've got a shortcut track for large infrastructure projects to aid people getting back into work through government funded infrastructure projects and local government. And we've got a wider review of the RMA that is, it's actually already on my desk, goes to Cabinet in the next week or two and will be released before the election, which has been led by Tony Randerson, a retired Court of Appeal judge. So there is work coming on the RMA and the Building Act you should ask someone else about. I think we've got risk allocation wrong there personally, but anyway.
Thank you from Stephen Jacoby.
Yes, thank you, Minister. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Minister, for the work that you and your officials have been doing over this time to keep the markets open and trade flowing, and very high level of engagement with the private sector. One of the things that's been put off somewhat by COVID is our plan to open up the Southern Link between Asia, New Zealand and South America, although funnily enough there have been flights from South America routing through New Zealand up to China and back the other way all through this period. But do you think that idea might come back again once COVID is over, and what can we do, government and business, to be able to expedite that?
I don't know the answer to that yet, and I suspect Air New Zealand wouldn't know the answer to that yet, and if they don't know the answer, then I think it'll take a wee while to see how Airlinks recover and what happens to them. We're still interested in the idea because it's better that those things hub through Auckland than through other areas. It does rely upon a level of connectivity between Auckland and South America that will depend on the economics of those routes for the airlines that run them. And you know, all airlines in the world are struggling at the moment, not just our own carrier, which, you know, is faced with these enormous challenges, but also I've seen in the news the problems that LATAM are having, and no doubt every other airline in the world. So we should be continuing to see if we can have a rational outcome to this, which would see Auckland as the hub for freight links to South America, but we'll have to see how it rolls.
Minister, I'm going to take the opportunity, if there's nothing else from the floor, I'll do one last question to you, and I think some of it has come through in the questions around the smelter and New Zealand Steel, but I think it refers back to that very good relationship we keep on saying that we have with China, and the question from RL here was, how can we utilise our relationship with China to support and expedite our infrastructure initiatives post-COVID, given China's capability in that space?
Well, our rules of sourcing already allow anyone to tender for a project, and that will remain. I think it's even less likely that as a country there would be a social consensus around bringing in cheap labour in order to do it. That won't happen. So the rest of it's a financial transaction, and it's a free market. So yeah, go for it.
Minister, I think you've been very clear this morning in the messages around brand, the New Zealand brand, and the positioning that gives us with our trade, the values of us as a country, and I think the recognition that we are going to need to reset the way that we do business, and a lot of that's going to be around value rather than volume. I think we could probably spend a lot more time here with your Q&A. You have a diary, the PM has a busy schedule for the day. On behalf of everyone here, let me thank you for your contribution to the start of this day. Thanks so much.